Hello. We gather for conversation, and we're glad that you could join us today. Our partner today is Dr. Paul Seward, who has written a book called Parent, Patient Care. And we're delighted to have him today to tell us about this book and about his long experience as an emergency medicine doctor. You wrote at the beginning something about stories and the situation rather than just an event. Could you help us clarify that?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of doctor books out there which will sort of be, wow, there was a big knife sticking in his chest and wasn't that, weird, etc. And I was not interested in that sort of story. What interested me, why I loved the ER for all those years, was because of the human situations. What's the difference? An event is something that happens, and this is something I say in the preface. An event is something that happens. A situation is something that, as it's happening, asks for a response from either the people present or, in the case of the story, the people who are reading. And fundamentally, what I hope to have accomplished with these stories is to put people in situations that were situations I was in, and so that they can have some experience of what it was like, what it is like to work in an ER, to be in an ER, and to be confronted with not just the events but the situations that occur there.
In that introduction, you also made a profound principles statement about the reason for our being here, which is?
The reason that we are here is to learn, I think I used the phrase, have our noses rubbed in, the question of caring for people who we don't know. We live in a world that, I'll step back a second. It's easy for us to love our family and our friends and our little group. And that makes sense because for, a couple 100,000 years, in our entire lifetime, that's the only people we would ever know. And to have a stranger be there is not common, not usual, a thing of some danger. And now we live in the opposite situation. We live in a world in which almost everyone is a stranger, and therefore we have to be, do I do something about that?
Go ahead.
Okay. I just want to turn it off, and then we can edit this little blip out, I hope. Good, sorry about that. I should have done this before. Are we making cuts in this thing?
No, we're just
Okay.
right.
We're going to do it right through.
We're
My wife wants me to bring home some semi-sweet chocolate chips, and this is a very important interruption.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. In any case, let me say that again. I think that's what we're here to do. I think we are here to learn to care about people because they are human beings, not because they are sisters or parents or neighbors, etc. It's easy to love our neighbors. It's hard to love everyone else. Look at the news. There we are. And the thing about the ER, when I was a young man and trying to decide what to be when I grew up, question that I'm still working on, I thought I'd go into medicine because I thought it was a good place to study what it was like to be a human being and then learn what obligations that entailed, and then be able to do something about them, because if you're a doctor, you can do something about them. The only thing I disagree with is I think every occupation, every way of life, every job throws us into that situation every day. We're always being confronted with whether or not or how much to care about the person in front of us. But in the ER, it's got a big red crayon and it blinks and it's there. And that's what I think it's for.
And part of that is expressed in your conviction that we're hardwired for love. Is that?
We are hardwired for love, but that hardwiring has a lot of trouble extending to people beyond our, and to use the word they're using all the time, beyond our tribe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're not here to learn to love our tribe. We've been given that for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
We're here to love people who aren't in our tribe. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, you've been doing this a few years. Quite a few years, right?
My first shift in the ER was in the summer of 1966 as a medical student. I admit I was only 5 years old at the time. And my last shift in the ER was last June.
Hmm.
I spent 20 years trying to retire and tapering off and tapering down and doing other things, etc. And I was probably working full-time in the ER for 30 plus years. So yeah.
Yeah. You tell very interesting stories.
Thank you.
They're clear and they're understandable, both in terms of medical facts, probably better than anything I've read lately.
Thank you.
And also then the people that are involved. So how did that writing come about for you? I mean, was that easy? Was that hard? Was that...
It's hard. I write badly when I'm writing to try to be like another writer or to try to impress somebody else, etc. I think I write best when I do two things. First of all, when I'm writing as if I'm talking to you. If I'm telling you a story in my own voice and just write it out. Then you take out the sandpaper and you start sanding word by word, word by word. And after about 10 or 20 changes and edits, etc., you might have something that looks easy and natural. It has to be both. It has to be thrown on the page naturally, in which case it'll be a pile of junk, and then you get to take that natural pile of junk and make it into something smooth and beautiful.
And you picked these stories out of so many alternatives and options, right?
Yes and no. First of all, as I say in the beginning of this book, every single one of these stories happened, yes, but they happened a lot of times. I mean, there are certain numbers of things that happen in the ER. People come in badly injured, people die, people come in pain, people come in confused, people come in with questions. And that happens over and over and over again. Some are more illustrative than others, and I plucked those out. But in a sense, this is going to sound strange, there's only one patient in an ER. He just comes in all the time, or she. And that's the person that you walk into a room and say, "Hi, I'm Paul Seward, I'm one of the doctors here. How can I help you?" And then you interact and you find out what's going on, and then you examine them, you do some things, you offer some things, you give some instructions, and then at the end you ask them, is there anything else I can do for you? And if they say, "No, thank you, doctor," you're done. If they say anything else, you're not done because you didn't do your job. And then you do it again and again and again. I think you'll find I end a lot of stories by going on to the next patient. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does. I mean, it's this is a life process you're in. You're just, today is a new day.
Yeah, and every patient is different, and every patient is the same. One could argue that, back to the previous thing, every patient is that human being you're supposed to be loving. Every patient is that person that's been put in front of you to figure out what you're going to do about it, and how tired you are, and how annoyed you are, and how much your back hurts, and whatever, and whether that's going to get in the way with doing what this patient came to you for. I also want to say that if I sound like I'm some kind of a noble human being or some kind of a deeply empathetic human being, I don't see myself that way. I see that I'm a person who understands the values.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is not that I can execute them, but that I have no excuse for not doing so. I do not know how well I have done all my life with this, but this is to show you what it felt like trying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was some really great lines in regards to that. I'm trying to about the trying. We had a line about trying that you had tried, and you asked some questions about you wonder.
I know exactly the
talk
story
about,
you mean.
Talk about wondering.
I'm going to wager you're talking about a story where the patient died.
Right.
And by the way, there's a lot of stories where the patient died. And you wonder if you'd had a better day, if you knew a little more, or someone else had been there instead of you, if things would have turned out differently. And you have to, but the other side of that is you have to because you're always basically trying to be the best doctor you can. But at the same time, there is no perfection in medicine. The best you can do is the best you can do, and humans and bad things will happen. And what I used to tell the residents when something really bad had happened, or where they thought they'd really screwed up, I said, you know something, you knew when you were getting into this line of work that you'd see bad stuff. And you also knew that you would see patients who died in spite of the best that you could do. What you didn't know you were signing up for is that now and then a patient would have a bad outcome or would die, and you couldn't say that you'd done the best you could. You saw a mistake you made, or you worried about the mistake you made, and now you feel like you can't do that. But what they need to understand is that's part of the gift they give. Because if you can't live with the pain of being imperfect in a job which requires perfection, and therefore having bad things go wrong, then you can't do this job. And if you can't do this job, who will? Someone who doesn't care. And so what I always told them is, think of the pain that you're having right now as being part of the gift that you're giving to your patients, as being willing to feel this way in order to keep on doing what you do. Now that sounds really great, and I wish someone would tell me that, because I'd really like to be able to do it myself.
Well, I pulled out a line that I really liked, and as an affirmative line.
Thank you.
Within the midst of all that pain and uncertainty, because it's really uncertain what's going to happen when someone comes in, and where this is going to go, what is it, where is it going to go, how do I,
Yes.
The line I liked was tragedies that can be fixed. Can you say something about that?
And remind me the story that was.
That was under burden of choice in the fourth
Yeah.
chapter.
Yeah. Let me think of it not so much in the fourth chapter, but in the
Okay.
chapter about
Sure,
the woman,
wherever.
the young woman who had the rash and who turned out to have
Yes.
meningococcal meningitis. This was a woman who came in, and as she walked in the door, I looked at her, and essentially I knew what was going to happen over the next 24 hours, because I'd seen it before. She had advanced meningococcal septicemia, big words meaning you had some really bad germs and they were all through your bloodstream. And they'd progressed enough so that they were almost certainly going to kill her. There's a bunch of things we could do to try to stop it, but the odds were that they weren't going to work. And I knew that. That didn't make me stop doing everything. I obviously did everything because one likes to be wrong in those situations, but they aren't. But the point is, that was a tragedy that couldn't be fixed, but it went hand in hand with a different tragedy that could be fixed, that could be helped, that could be. And that was the tragedy of being her mother or her sister, etc., who'd been with her for the last 24 hours and had been seeing her come with a little sore throat, I go, fever, no big deal, and then who suddenly saw her becoming horribly ill, who called the ambulance, and now here's their daughter, who literally 24 hours before had been normal, and now is basically dying. And the tragedy was her death, but the other tragedy was the loss of a daughter, the loss of a sister, the loss of this beloved family member. And the third tragedy was the blame and inner-directed anger that is so much a part of that experience. And I couldn't, yes, I tried and tried. We did everything. But I didn't think that the tragedy that could be helped was the tragedy of her death. The tragedy that could be helped was trying to make sure that the people who were living through this and who would still be alive the next day and the next day and the next day had an understanding of what happened that would not require them to blame themselves. That would not, because they were going to be sad, but they were also going to be angry. God had been very mean to them that day. But I think it was very important for them to know that this was a tragedy, but not something that they had caused. And that was the tragedy. And they were my patients as much as she was. Does that make sense?
It does. But it also makes it makes that time so critical and valuable, because you only see patients in the ER once, right?
Mostly. We do have people who come in a lot. That's another tragedy.
Right.
But yeah, mostly. Yeah, and people say, gee, how can you see patients when you've never met them before and you're never going to see them again? I think that comes down to the fact that I've just met you. I've never seen you before. We may never meet again. Does that keep us from recognizing one another, from me seeing that you're a human being like me, that and you can accomplish a great deal in a very short time. And our job is just to have an interview. The job I have with them is they've come to ask me something really important. You don't sit in an ER waiting room unless it's really important.
Right.
They're frightened. They have both a disease problem and they have a information problem. Can you fix this? But what's going on? What's happening? And you have to have a lot of bad interpersonal skills not to be able to, hi, my name's Paul Seward, I'm one of the doctors. How can I help you today?
But it does take the development of those interpersonal relationship skills, doesn't it?
Yeah,
or
I
does it
suppose
come
so.
out of the situation?
I think it's both. I think it comes out. People say, how do you manage to be a compassionate person in all the stresses of the ER? And the answer is, there are days I'm tired. There's days I'm ticked off. There's days I'm burnt out by the, in fact, and now I don't do it anymore. But that's because I'm an old guy. But those aren't contradictions. Those are just things that you have to put up with. You know, everybody has bad days, everybody has tired days, etc. Right. But the problem hasn't been changed by that situation. And I guess similarly, I mean, you don't need to have Dale Carnegie stuff. You know, anybody out there still know who Dale Carnegie was?
Not too many.
You know, how to win friends and influence people and all that kind of stuff. Yes, it's nice. There's little things. Shake hands with people. That's how you touch people, etc. Sit down makes people think you've been there longer. Those are all tricks of the trade. But the real thing you have to do is you have to care about being there and let it show and have it be true. And if you're tired, okay, you can let that show too, but you can't let it get in the way. Go take a nap or something. But am I making? I don't. It's a hard question to answer.
Yeah. Well, yes, you do. I mean, you are making your sense, and that is. It's really calls for engagement with a person on an immediate level, with immediate response, and not where you have to be perfect and have a good bedside manner, but where you need to be able to know what to do, or how to do, or at least how to find out what to do. Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, actually, it just makes me think of a phrase an old mentor of mine once said. You know, people don't care what you know until they know if you care.
Oh, that's a great line.
That's it in a nutshell.
That is a great line.
I'm amazed at what people will forgive. Many years ago, when I was actually first starting out in the ER, and I was really mostly a pediatrician in those days who was working in the ER, and a boy came in and he had a sore belly, and I felt his belly. I thought he had appendicitis. And so I called the surgeon, said, I think this guy's got appendicitis. The surgeon came in. And the surgeon spent about 30 years working in the Far East. And he says, you know, I don't think so. I think this might be typhoid, and he might be having an intestinal infection from typhoid. I think I'm going to put him in and give him some antibiotics and hydrate him a little bit, et cetera. And I said, well, okay, well, you're the surgeon. And he got worse during the night, but the guy didn't come in during the night. And I came back the next morning, and he'd gotten a lot worse. And the nurse actually asked me to go down the hall and see him, and I said, gee, he's got a ruptured appendix. You know, it's a tough diagnosis, but you can make it. And the family was in the room, and they said, can you do something? And so I called the surgeon that I knew down in San Francisco. This was in Northern California. And I talked to the surgeon here, and I said, I think he's got a ruptured appendix, and do you mind if I... And the guy said, okay, do that kind of wash your hands. And he did, and he was down there, and he was there for 3 or 4 days, and got cleaned out by the pediatric surgeon there and came back home. And did fine ultimately, but he had a heck of a 2 weeks. And then about a week or so later, the family came into the ER. And they had a little box, a little present for me. He said, Dr. Seward, I really want to thank you. Here's this little present. And I opened it up, and it was it was a carving of some kind, etc. And they said, we have another thing to ask you. You know that doctor who took care of him? We were really so angry at him. Do you think we ought to sue him? And I sat there and I said to myself, you know, this is very interesting. Because I'm the doctor who took care of him. And that other doctor also took care of him. And we both, I, against my better judgment, but, and, you know, allowed it. I share the equal responsibility for the fact that this was missed. And what's the difference? He didn't come in at night. He didn't seem to care. I seem to care. I'm a wonderful doctor, and he they want to sue. Is that?
Yeah. Oh, that's right on target. Yeah. We talked about the fact you were a pediatrician to start on, and that emergency rooms were not the way. So could maybe go back and fill in kind of that part of the history. Yep. Because unless we know the history, we tend to think that everything is the way it's always been.
Oh, no.
And then if you have some thoughts about ER
Today.
today
Yes.
and maybe into the future, that would be helpful.
And I'm going to, all of you out there, could you stay for a couple hours? Because, no, I guess you can't, but we'll do the best we can. In the old days, hospitals, yes, had ERs, but they were staffed by a nurse, no doctor.
Mhm.
The ambulances were run by funeral directors. People were kind of brought in, and then the nurse said, better call the doctor on call, who might have been a dermatologist, and dermatologists are wonderful doctors, but they don't really like to take care of emergencies, and I don't blame them. And then if that was then the other guy would come in, and it was very inefficient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then people started coming back from the war. That's World War II, the Vietnam War, everything, and saying, well, in the war we have all these wonderful paramedics and battlefield stations, why don't we have those here? And both the doctors and the hospitals and the patients all said we need a better way. And so the first thing they did, and this is back in the late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s, was change the system whereby instead of every doctor on the medical staff, having to answer the phone from the ER, there would be a doctor hired to be in the ER to see the ER patients all the time. And that was a great idea. Unfortunately, that meant you were hiring a doctor that didn't exist, i.e. the trained emergency physician. They didn't have trained emergency physicians. They had pediatricians.
Yeah.
And and I started doing that. And then I started doing that for a while. And I said, hey, I like this. And so I quit my practice and became a full-time emergency physician. By then I'd been working long enough and had been taught by all the people I used to call in to come and help me how to be an ER doc. And by then the trade had organized, formed examinations, a set of, and emergency medicine had come into existence. And so I became an emergency physician by, quote, grandfathering and being trained that way. And over the years, a lot of things became ER property. Putting tubes in your throat so you can breathe. That used to be something owned by the anesthesiologists, and rightly so, because it's a very dangerous trick. I have a chapter on that in the book. But in the last 25, 30 years, the leaders in emergency medicine created courses and text and things like that, so that emergency physicians are now all fully trained to put that tube in so you get to live instead of die. And that's, I think, the situation. It grew out of almost a social need rather than a medical need. And now it's, I think, pretty full grown and is filling the medical need. And now you ask the second question of, well, how are things today? Fine, but there's a problem. Because it was such a good solution for the absence of emergency care, it's being applied to the solution for another problem, which is the absence of health insurance, the absence of enough facilities, the absence of basically access to primary care. So it has become the receptacle for all of the situational, organizational problems. The answer is go to the ED. I was at a lecture, a year or so ago, when our guy was talking about seeing a patient with a laceration of his hand. And I wish I could remember his name, but I don't. And he was sewing up his hand. He said, when did you do this? The guy said, yesterday. And the guy says, yesterday? Don't you know you should come in right away to get these things sewn up and cleaned up or they get infected? He said, yeah, I came in yesterday. I've been waiting all night until today for you to get to me. That's a failed system. And that's a system that just throwing the ER into it to try to solve the problem is not solving the problem, and it's ultimately corrosive to the emergency medicine system.
We're kind of winding down a little bit. So are there things that you'd like to say to people about stories about ER, medicine, the whole whatever?
Wow.
Okay. In a way to be encouraging or to be uplifting or mindful or.
I'm going to read you the last sentence in this book.
All right.
Okay.
Some years ago, I was at an educational meeting where I listened to a talk given by an emergency physician on the subject of interacting with patients. Recently, he had taken care of a small child with meningitis. Everyone had done their jobs well. The patient had been rapidly assessed, quickly treated with the appropriate antibiotics, and ultimately survived intact. After all the work was finished and the patient was waiting to go up to the pediatric intensive care unit, the doctor sat and talked with the child's mother, asking how she was doing and whether she had any questions. She said no, but she thanked him, and she told him how frightened she had been on the way to the hospital. Because of not knowing what was wrong with your child? He asked. She said, no, I knew that he was very sick. I was terrified because I didn't know who you would be.
Oh my.
Okay? And this chapter was about my own experience as a patient in the emergency department, which was very good. Mm-hmm. And I said, but I've only been in the ER once, and I'm an old guy now, but I've been healthy. And so I'd finish up by saying, I've been lucky. Even so, I know that somewhere up ahead, there awaits an ER visit that will not be so benign. However, I'm confident that when that happens, even if I have never met them before, I will be among competent and caring friends, as I believe will you. And that is what I think of the emergency medicine profession right now.
And with that, we say thank you very much and look forward to continuing the conversation in so many other possible ways.
Thank you for the privilege, and I promise next time to turn my phone off.
Okay, we'll do that.